What an honor it is to have an opportunity to appear here at the 25th anniversary celebration of the Committee of 100. I wasn't able to come to the gala last night because I have two Asian American grandchildren who were with me in Washington, and I see Dr. Kissinger more frequently than I see my grandchildren, so I had to make a strategic choice, and I favored the grandchildren. But I had this event on my mind, and as I looked at my grandchildren, I couldn't help thinking, what will they be like 25 years from now? And my conclusion was that if they're as healthy and have accomplished as much as the Committee of 100 has accomplished in 25 years, I will be a very happy grandparent. All of you know that the Committee of 100 was founded 25 years ago with two key missions: to promote the full participation of all Chinese Americans in American society, and to promote constructive dialogue and relationships between the peoples and leaders of the United States and Greater China. We've been hearing today, and we've been seeing in person, examples of the full participation of Chinese Americans in American society. There have been Chinese Americans in the past who reached positions of prominence, but there are more today than there were before. It's a good trend, and I hope to see even more in the future. I've been privileged to work with the Committee of 100 since the very beginning, and I am particularly familiar with their efforts to promote constructive dialogue and relationships between China and the United States. The committee was formed at a particularly difficult time in U.S. China relations. The events of June 4th, 1989 in Beijing had caused a precipitous plunge in attitudes toward China in the United States. Fair or not, as we have heard examples repeatedly today, when American attitudes toward a particular country sour, there is a spillover effect toward American citizens who are ethnically linked to that country. As everyone here knows, Asians are a very diverse group of people, but most Americans cannot distinguish between Chinese and Japanese and Koreans and Indonesians and Thai. As a result, when Americans develop hostile attitudes toward any Asian country, the spillover effect affects all Asian Americans to some degree. Since the founders of the Committee of 100 were prominent and successful Chinese Americans who had made many cultural, educational, architectural, and business contributions to the United States, its members from the beginning were imbued with a strong sense of civic duty to correct misperceptions that were burdening the U.S. China relationship and to foster constructive dialogue between the two countries. I sympathized enormously with these goals and was acutely aware of these misperceptions, because a year after the founding of the committee, I found myself as the United States ambassador in Beijing at a difficult time in our bilateral relationship, and I had to deal with these misperceptions on a daily basis. We've come a long way since that time 25 years ago. But the reality is, and I want to stress this, the road ahead is going to be even more difficult. U.S.-China relations are in transition. The United States is still adjusting to the challenge of dealing with a different sort of China under its new dynamic leader, Xi Jinping. In the 2 years since Xi Jinping assumed China's top leadership position, he has moved boldly on both the domestic and foreign fronts. In the process, he has confused many outside observers, and even some Chinese, by selectively invoking Dengist pragmatism, Maoist ideological guidelines, and Adam Smith's devotion to the market. Internationally, he has backed a muscular foreign policy focused on defending China's territorial claims and enhancing China's leadership role in the region. At the same time, he's called for a new type of great power relationship between China and the United States that can head off dangerous strategic rivalry between our two countries. Under President Xi, China has moved away from Deng Xiaoping's prescription that China should keep a low profile while pursuing economic development. China now boasts of having a proactive foreign policy, and President Xi has launched a series of proposals over the last year that have a distinctive Chinese brand identification. To be frank, the United States is having difficulty adjusting to the fact that a Chinese government that used to seem to be quite laid back in putting forward its own proposals is now coming out with proposals at a mile a minute, so fast, in fact, that Chinese can't explain what many of the new proposals are all about. At the very least, this pattern of activity suggests that China, under Xi Jinping, is seeking to carve out a leadership role in Asia that is equal to or greater than that of the United States. Xi Jinping, President Xi, is committing major Chinese resources to pursuit of this goal. This is quite different from the proposition that China is trying to drive the United States out of Asia. Many Americans think that's the case, but Chinese leaders are realistic enough to realize that for the foreseeable future, they lack both the capability and the regional support to bring about that outcome. They also need decent relations with the United States to achieve their ambitious development goals. Nonetheless, China under Xi Jinping is clearly posing an enormous challenge to the United States and its leadership in East Asia and potentially elsewhere. Regardless of how we refer to our strategic goal, both countries believe, and both leaders at the highest level have made clear that we should not let the normal dynamic between a rising country and an established country drive the relationship toward rivalry or conflict. China uses the term a new type of great power relationship. The United States has wobbled around. At times it's endorsed that terminology. It's backed away from it more recently, but the underlying concept is one that's understood in the U.S. government and is endorsed, and that is we do not want to see the U.S.-China relationship marked by hostile strategic rivalry. There's no way to accomplish this goal if the established power is not prepared to recognize and accommodate the legitimate interests of the rising power. What constitutes legitimate interests? This is something that needs to be determined through bilateral and multilateral diplomatic consultations. That's how legitimate interests are determined with every country in the world. Common sense suggests this would certainly have to include a greater role for the rising power in the institutions of global governance. President Xi touched on this point in his important speech to the Central Conference on Foreign Affairs Work in November last year, when he said that China should advance multilateral diplomacy, work to reform the international system and global governance, and increase the representation and say of China and other developing countries. This is a forward-leaning position. China is asserting a right to a greater role in global governance. In the same speech, he emphasized that today's world is changing, a world in which the international system and international order are going through deep adjustment, and a world in which the relative international forces are in profound shift in favor of peace and development. Now, some of that is normal jargon, peace and development, all countries favor peace and development. But the basic point he's making, and it's one you do not hear frequently referred to in American foreign policy, is that the world is changing, and China is asserting a right to have a significant influence over the nature of those changes. He stressed the protracted nature, again, this is President Xi, of what he called this contest over the international order, while affirming that the direction of reform of the international system will remain unchanged. This poses the issue very nicely, although I would not use the word contest. The world is indeed changing. China and the United States can either work together in shaping these changes, or we can engage in a protracted contest over the international order. Which it will be depends on the willingness of each country to accommodate the legitimate interests of the other. Unless we are prepared to do so, we will be pursuing the old model of great power relations, which has too often in the past resulted in conflict. Fortunately, the positive results from the Beijing U.S. China summit in Beijing last November has given positive impetus to Sino-U.S. relations, so now is a good time to press ahead. The fact that President Xi will be making a state visit to the United States this fall is again the sort of what we call an action-forcing event that will cause bureaucracies on both sides, in China and the United States, to look for ways to inject positive momentum into the bilateral relationship. The biggest challenge lies in the contest for military supremacy in the Western Pacific. China has a legitimate need to protect itself from maritime threats, but an effort by China to dominate the maritime space in the Western Pacific would threaten the interests of the maritime countries, some of whom are allies of the United States, which cannot be a disinterested party. Americans are rightly worried about how China will use its growing military power. Some people say that intentions are unknowable, so you have to judge potential threats by capabilities, and China's capabilities are rising. This is a gross oversimplification. Capabilities are relevant to intentions, they do not determine them. At the time of the U.S. China breakthrough in 1971-72, Chinese capabilities remained the same, but the U.S. assessment of Chinese intentions changed fundamentally. Both Japan and India have formidable military forces, but the United States does not feel threatened. To achieve our goal with China, we need to create a relationship where each side can have strong military capabilities without feeling threatened by the other. This was the case in the 1970s and 1980s, when the United States military capabilities far exceeded those of China, but the United States had no intention of attacking China or threatening its territorial integrity and acted accordingly. And China at that time not only did not feel threatened by the United States, but for a time actually saw the U.S.-Japan alliance as a stabilizing factor in the Western Pacific. Accomplishing this goal of preventing strategic rivalry under present circumstances is going to be a Herculean task. A still unanswered question is whether it is possible to establish at the operational level a stable, conventional balance, military balance, throughout the Western Pacific region that meets the fundamental security needs of both China and the United States. It is reasonable to suppose that a stable military balance must be based as a minimum on an improved ability by China to defend its own territory and a U.S. military posture in the Western Pacific sufficiently strong to support U.S. interests and the credibility of its defense alliances. Historical experience suggests that there is no way to strike such a balance based on military capabilities alone. In short, this is not simply a defense problem. This is a problem of grand strategy, in which military capabilities must be viewed as only one element in an approach in which diplomacy, trade, education, people-to-people exchanges, and public statements by national leaders must all be brought into play. This is why the continuing role of the Committee of 100 is so important. Its members are richly endowed with the knowledge and experience to contribute to better understanding between China and the United States. This will take hard work and deep commitment. But based on its record over the last 25 years, I am confident that the Committee of 100 has the will and the leadership to rise to this challenge, so I wish you well in the future. Thank you.